Yeah, so thanks, David. The three questions were, is it logical to anticipate that enterprises rooted in the mindset of self-help and mutual action will have a significant role in a post-pandemic world? Edgar and Pat are going to come back to that one. What approaches and actions can be deployed to increase their prospects of playing such a role? And the third one is, will advocacy of the idea of a social and solidarity economy be a help or a hindrance in the process? So, you know, those are the quite big, chewy questions, but really it's about looking at the role of social enterprise, post-pandemic world. We want two views initially, group discussion, and then other levels of discussion. So, Edgar, it's Friday night and it's
right. Hello to everyone. I see lots of old friends and people I'd like to say hello to, and anybody that I don't know, obviously I say hello as well. Right, so I'm going to kick this off, and we'll have some room for questions later if the chair is willing.
Hello everyone. I'm going to jump straight in and answer the first question. Is it logical to anticipate that enterprises rooted in the mindset of self-help and mutual action will have a significant role in a post-pandemic world? I remember well the recession of the mid-1970s, again in the early 1980s, and the global financial crisis that emerged during 2007. I also remember that every time there has been an economic downturn, supporters of co-ops rush to tell us that this represents a new dawn that will lead to their rebirth. Sad to say, it has always proved to be a false dawn. The resurgence of co-ops has never happened. I want to briefly explore why. I would like to pause for a moment to tell you what I mean by the term self-help enterprises. The simplest way for me to show this is to use this diagram. This illustrates the different forms of enterprises. I hope that those of you familiar with this diagram will bear with me while I briefly explain. Enterprises can first be divided between those that rely on the market for their survival and those that don't. So here I'm excluding those organisations run with the support of subsidy or charitable donations. Next, enterprises can be divided into those motivated by the generation of profits and those that are driven to achieve other outcomes. Outcomes-driven enterprises can be divided into two distinct groups. First, there are those that are cause-driven, sometimes referred to as social enterprises. The second form of outcomes-driven enterprises are those motivated by self-help and mutual action to improve their members' position within a market. Self-help enterprises exist to serve their members. This means delivering the outcomes that their members want. This is fundamentally different from being a cause-driven enterprise. From here on, I shall just talk about co-ops, but I ask you to understand that I am also referring to all of the many other different types of self-help enterprises. Let's get back to why it is there hasn't been a widespread resurgence of co-ops in response to previous economic downturns. Although there have been spurts of growth driven by the specific needs of segments of the population. For example, In the UK, the growth of community-owned shops and pubs, mainly in rural areas. When the crisis caused by COVID-19 recedes, governments in many nations will be deep in debt, and the ability of the state to provide support to their citizens in many ways will be much impaired. More than ever, ordinary people will need enterprises that promote fairness while helping them to improve their lives. Both my experiences and my studies tell me that the failure of co-ops to surge is mainly down to a few core factors. We cannot rationally hope for a revival of co-ops unless they become truly fit for purpose in today's world, and we must remove the following impediments to their development. First, we must get current and future generations to understand that if people are to rediscover the self-help mindset, they must be educated in its significance and be supplied with enterprises that exemplify the benefits they provide. Second, the absence of a robust and widely followed enterprise model, one that includes the provision of strong independent oversight, the kind of oversight that ensures that co-ops deliver on their purpose and stick to their true functions. Co-ops need an enterprise model that is understood by ordinary members and is honestly embraced by all those that direct and manage the enterprise. Thirdly, co-ops are handicapped by the fact that many claiming to support co-ops insist that they form part of their utopian vision or are merely tools to be used for social engineering in pursuit of a partisan political dogma. Fourthly, in most countries, the state has not yet provided co-ops with an adequate legal basis or a positive public policy framework. It's vital that we get the law and policies that co-ops truly need. We'll now move on to the next question and outline what we can do to enhance the prospects of co-ops playing a more significant role in improving the lives of ordinary people in a post-pandemic world. The question is, what approaches and actions can be deployed to increase the prospects of this form of enterprise playing a more significant role? In the UK, and in most other countries too, the populace is not imbued with the self-help mindset. The mass of the people is schooled in the idea that they are reliant on big corporate businesses, big government or charities to change anything of importance in their lives. Most of our political leaders are fostering dependence rather than encouraging self-help, self-responsibility and mutual action. In the UK, if you ask almost anyone, even the so-called educated, they will say that a co-op is just another profit-chasing retail shop like Tesco and Aldi. This is because many of the enterprising bearing names that imply that they are genuine co-ops have mutated into quasi-commercial businesses that primarily benefit the people that run them day to day. Co-operators need to demand that self-help and mutual action becomes a significant part of the curriculum in the education system at all levels. At the same time, we must retrain our educators so they are able to provide students with the tools they need to operate authentic co-ops. Currently, much of what is offered as being education about co-ops is little more than a series of statements outlining the theoretical advantages of them, and not sufficiently focused on development of the hard skills needed to set up and run them. If co-ops are to prosper, we need to help their leaders, managers and members properly understand their model of enterprise, a model that is based on lessons learned from several centuries of developing the practices needed to form the critical human systems that make them work as they should. Systems that help them to focus on delivering what their members truly need while sustaining viability and democratic control. Most co-ops that fail do so when they lose sight of their function, which is to intervene in a market in the best interest of their members. A key part of the enterprise model for co-ops is their market intervention strategy, which is often notable by its absence in many co-ops. Stark examples of the absence of a market intervention strategy were to be found in UK consumer cooperatives by the mid-50s, when most were out of touch with what was happening within retailing, and like most of their European counterparts, were heading for oblivion. They were distracted from their true purpose when led by people with political ambitions. They became riddled with corruption and were in many cases run by employees and their relatives. Their consumer members became nothing more than a market to be exploited. Membership must be paramount in every aspect of a co-op's activities. Selling to non-members is a practice that is the source of many of their ills. Where co-ops regard customers as being more important than members, then that enterprise has a big problem. This is the elephant in the room that usually nobody wants to talk about. Consumer-owned enterprises should only have members and soon-to-be members. In worker co-ops, all those employed, that is working in the enterprise, ought to be a member or a time-limited probationary member. In producer-owned co-ops, its services should be only available to producer members. In all cases, the practice of allowing easy access to the privilege of membership by non-members can completely undermine the integrity of the enterprise as a genuine co-op. Co-ops do have the power to radically change their members' lives, but they only do this when they are genuine co-ops and when they act honestly and fairly on behalf of their members. This should build the capacity and resilience of their members and help them to make better decisions about their lives, whereas most commercial businesses maximize profits when they exploit the weaknesses of their customers, employees, and suppliers. The state should not become directly involved in running co-ops. but co-ops do need the state to provide a framework of legislation and a positive framework of public policy, providing protection against many of the threats they face. Above all, the state needs to protect the interests of grassroots members, including measures to prevent co-ops from being hijacked and to make it a requirement for proper oversight to be built into the rules of all co-ops. Co-ops are held back when civil servants, policymakers, professionals, and the public in general have no valid perception as to what co-ops are, and when they don't recognise the self-help option. Self-help solutions ought to be considered the first option rather than being the last resort. Co-ops must become an integral part of the mainstream economy, being ready to step in whenever the market is not performing as it should. This will only happen when the success of co-ops that adopt the self-help enterprise model prove their capacity to run large-scale organisations as genuine co-ops. We need to get self-help and mutual action onto the national agenda, for example, by the appointment of a self-help champion to work inside government. The tasks of the champion should include getting the necessary positive public policy framework in place and ensuring that self-help and mutual action is promoted throughout all government departments and agencies. We must get our governments to be committed to empowering their citizens and to be proactive in enabling citizens to set up co-ops that can challenge the dominant players in any market, especially whenever they aren't serving the people as they should. Moving on to the final question, which is, will advocacy of the idea of a social and solidarity economy be a help or a hindrance in the process? There is no universally agreed definition of the term social and solidarity economy. The nearest I can find is a provisional one offered by the International Labour Organization, which is as follows. A concept designating enterprises and organizations, in particular cooperatives, mutual benefit societies, associations, foundations and social enterprises, which have the specific feature of producing goods, services and knowledge while pursuing both economic and social aims and fostering solidarity. I've also seen several alternative definitions. Most are far more esoteric than the ILO version. The idea of lumping together self-help enterprises, co-ops, with social enterprises may be a useful way of expanding the market for those with courses, research and consultancy to sell, but it's not a sensible way of providing services to support genuine self-help enterprises. This not least because it suggests that there is a single body of knowledge encompassing the needs of genuine co-ops, along with charities and cause-driven enterprises. Mixing enterprises that so often create dependency with genuine self-help enterprises does nothing to build a consensus around the importance of promoting the self-help mindset. Social enterprises are not always democratically controlled, many being run by self-appointed trustees or patrons. They are often rooted in concepts that directly contradict the self-help mindset. Many are in fact profit-generating enterprises where some of or all of their profits are used to support their cause. And some social enterprises are nothing more than front organizations for major corporate businesses. Also, some significant charities have become marketing tools used by big businesses. The concept can also provide a cloak of respectability for mutant co-ops and for so-called social entrepreneurs who may generate a few jobs but in the main provide themselves with a livelihood. Authentic co-ops should be helping ordinary people cope with the new reality because they use an economic system which includes the mutual ownership of resources, and they are driven by resource optimization, which is the alternative to profit maximization, which drives commercial businesses. Change will not be triggered by preaching a utopian vision. It will only come when people resolve to take practical action together with others. I believe that our overall economic system must change if it is to respond to the threats presented by climate change, the worldwide challenge to democratic systems of government, and to more fairly distribute resources between the haves and have-nots. Change will only be brought about by an independent movement for social change. It cannot be a function tacked onto co-ops or be funded from surpluses that rightly belong to all their members. Finally, let me remind you of the statement made in the Rochdale Pioneers' Almanac of 1860. This preceded the list of practices followed by them that later became erroneously known as the Rochdale Principles, but that's another debate for another day. It's very important to remember that the pioneers were working class people whose common sense practices spread like wildfire throughout the world, and this at a time when methods of communication were limited to the spoken word, face to face, or by words on paper. The present cooperative movement does not intend to meddle with the various religious or political differences which now exist in society, but by a common bond, namely that of self-interest, to join together the means, the energies, and the talents of all for the common benefit of each. Thanks for watching. I look forward to your questions and our discussions in due course.
Well, thank you, Edgar. There was lots, and it was great to see all that chatter in the chat box as well. And there's lots. I mean, we've had the privilege over the past 3-4 weeks of meetings, so we've been actually talking about some of these issues as well as we've been bringing the session together. But without any ado, I would like, before we get into a discussion, actually, I want to bring in Pat to respond as well. So it's a response and also reflection as well. So Pat, over to you. You're on mute, Pat.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Right. Okay. What I want to share with you is some of the highlights of a manifesto that we launched with the Cooperative College and other fellow travelers about ways of attacking the curse of precarious work, which is only going to get worse, you know, in the years ahead for all sorts of reasons that most people know about, pretty self-evident. So a collective of us under COVID, you can see at the bottom, many of you know, including McEwen from working at UCLan and also with the Preston Co-op Development Network, and Simon Taylor, who did some initial work, really excellent work on union co-ops in the United States. So I wanted to share with you some of what we saw as way forward. I don't disagree. I completely support almost everything that Edgar has laid out. So this isn't really my view against his. It's much more of saying, well, what can we do about it? Where can we go? Based on what's emerging rather than actually just ideas. So if I can, just struggling here to get to the next slide. Seems to be stuck. Can you still hear me? Oh, there we go. Fine. It was just stuck there a moment ago. Okay, so the issue of precarious work is pretty, it's growing all the time. These are some figures over the last decade, but of course the number now is up to about 1 in 5 workers across a range of categories of precarious work. You can see that here. Very strongly evident is the self-employed. It's the casual agency workers has stayed about the same for the last decade in terms of numbers, but 0-hour contract workers and the self-employed have grown enormously. In fact, ONS figures show that really over the last decade, about 65% of all new jobs are being created by one-person businesses. So basically people are having to create their own work. And as you can see from the evidence, we've documented other reports with the Co-op College and Co-ops UK and Wales Co-op Centre. We're looking at 1.7 million of the self-employed, which is about 5 million, are earning below the minimum wage, and 77% of them are living in poverty. And 83% really are solo self-employed. In other words, they're not engaging any other person in their business. And gig economy workers are growing as the gig economy advances and expanding into all industries, teaching, you name it, education. For some reason, I'm just not able to move to the next. I don't know why it's stuck here. Sorry. I can't seem to go to the next slide.
Have you tried pressing your space?
Oh, there it goes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so the manifesto that we launched on the 2nd of July, which the Co-op College hosted, had a very broad audience across the UK, but also from Ireland and other parts of Europe and the United States and Canada. So the manifesto itself looks at 6 ways to create union co-ops for decent work. Let me just see if I skipped. No, that's right. So we're looking at pathways that I'll try to illustrate by give you some examples from the report itself. But the case studies are in at that link below to back them up. There's a dozen case studies for these different pathways. I'll come back to the SMART union co-op for the self-employed that's emerging, and it's quite interesting, the numbers. Of course, people in the UK will know of SUMA's success, but what's interesting about SUMA is that they've been effectively a union co-op since the 80s in their partnership with the Bakers Union, and they've been very successful as a co-op. And some of the figures in terms of the impact in terms of wages as a common and wages and conditions are in the case study. Very interesting. create a new co-op that's fully unionized. There's an Italian example in the report, and then there's also some worker buyout examples. But let me come on to look at some of the needs, because like with Rochdale Pioneers, and by the way, the shift in the last 10 years as precarious work has advanced at a rate of knots is that the labor share of national income has shifted from capital. Total national income has actually increased to capital by 10% over the past decade. And there's been the highest fall in real wages for 150 years, which takes you back to 1860. And this, the last slide that Edgar shared with us. Okay, so what are the needs? How do we address? These are the sorts of needs that can be addressed for union co-ops for the self-employed with trade unions. So two types of mutual aid, two associative democracy organization coming together: solidarity, advice, back office services, discounts, contracting collectively, co-working, and of course, all speaking to ILO recommendation 193 and the work of Sterling Smith with Syndicoop, Let's Organize. Now, you know, there have been, like SUMA, a number of organizations involved who've been in this field for a long time and actually are proof of concept, or they have been advancing. So the Actor Co-op Network is now up to 30 Actor Co-ops across England and Wales, founded in 2002, a consortium, the CPMA. And of course, their work hand in glove with equity in terms of negotiating agreements and providing services is exemplary for a very, very low paid sector of the economy, very precarious indeed for most actors. Obviously, there's many who aren't, you know, jobbing actors and who earn more, but actually the benefits of these actor co-ops is quite significant. Of course, there are examples. An interesting one with taxis is that the Edinburgh taxi business is dominated by two taxi co-ops and has been for some time because of the state policy or the local government policy and the role of Unite working with central taxis and city cabs. More recently, Cardiff has launched its own drive taxi co-op. We give an example in the manifesto with the support of GMB, city cabs, and the Wales Co-op Centre, but also some help from the taxi co-op in Southampton. Green taxis, there are many emerging taxi co-ops in the United States in the fight back against Uber, but this particular one in Denver, and also another one called Union Cabs in Denver, was supported by the Communication Workers of America to develop their IT and platform support. So the support lent by the trade unions was invaluable in this particular case. Now, Smart in Belgium is a very interesting example in that it started off in 1997 as a social enterprise, interestingly. It's evolved into a co-op for self-employed workers. It's designed a co-op system to give precarious workers intermittent help with a career path and access to effectively a salary. So effectively, what we would regard as employment rights and social protection are provided by the co-op as a kind of an umbrella co-op for freelancers. Offers workers the opportunity to build or preserve their social rights by allowing them to obtain the benefits that are just not otherwise accessible to freelancers, as we know in this country. And offers a range of back office services, as you can see there, similar to the actors co-ops and taxi co-op elements. But interesting in this case, the expansion side with the IT platform and guarantees, as you can see, payment within 7 days. So the issue of cash flow is resolved by this umbrella cooperative. Working with trade unions in France and Belgium at the moment to become a union co-op. There's a social dialogue going on. So if you just look at some of the numbers here, so they've been expanding over the past 10 years, as you can see, where this period of precariousness post-2008 has actually become the atypical work becoming the new normal. Membership has grown to 97,000 members, members involved in Belgium, and 22,000 in France, and about 20,000 more in other countries in Europe, where they're developing their local, effectively their own local affiliates. Now in the US, what we've seen in recent decades, since 2008, is unionized worker co-ops being reborn. Of course, Edgar's right. I mean, when you get a big downturn, whether it's you know, the 1920s or the 1970s, you do get, and 1980s, you do get unions and co-ops working together to do all sorts of things, to stop closures and to tackle threats. But here it's a response to trade union decline, with membership of trade unions declining in the United States in the last 40 or 50 years from about 37, 38% of the labor force to about 9%. And to tackle, of course, the issues we all know about: fragmentation, casualized work, and race to the bottom issues that both co-ops and trade unions are facing. So if we join forces, as the conversation began just after 2008, the largest trade union in the United States, U.S. Steelworkers, or United Steelworkers, because it's international and covers Canada and Mexico as well. But the work in the United States has been through a dialogue with Mondragon. Well, how can we design a model that would actually be good for the co-op movement and good for the trade union movement? And this is what has emerged: the idea of union co-op initiatives and a worker co-op handbook to address the educational issues for local authorities, for co-ops, for policymakers, and for grassroots organizers and members. What's very interesting about the model is that they've said, well, if we were looking at something that was actually kind of a jazz rock fusion, what would the actual governance look like? How would it be different? And so what they've done is they said, well, if we substituted the social committee in the Mondragon model, if you like, for a union, one or more unions involved on the union committee, then actually you can actually distribute the governance, and actually you can kind of get this kind of interdependent, cooperative interdependent kind of structure that actually, you know, doubles the power of economic democracy, potentially. And so you can see a number of unions have been welcomed in to be involved in union co-op initiatives. So there are a number of cities. Los Angeles, where I'm originally from, is one of them. Brooklyn, where my mom was born and raised. Number of places, about 8 cities involved with these union co-op initiatives on this particular model. It's not the only model, I must say, but it's a very interesting one, I think, because it tries to bring, particularly join at the hip, the union movement and the co-op movement. So you can see here they're beginning to develop an ecosystem in Cincinnati, Ohio. And Syl Ross has gone to one of their conferences, very impressed indeed. Came back fired up and added to the work we've done on developing this approach with her, enthusiasm, which is fantastic. And there, these local co-ops are emerging in terms of local food, community energy efficiency and retrofitting, setting up a community-owned street market, and they've now got a new business legacy fund set up under COVID to save jobs and provide a pathway to worker ownership. There's a link there that you can see for more information. Now, if we look at, let's say, I've got this, I was always impressed with, I know Roger Spear's on this call, but the third sector care report that was published in 1994 with the Open University Co-ops unit. They set out something like a vision for what's emerged in Italy in terms of the evolution and expansion of the social cooperative movement. but it was never taken up. It was never pursued. Although actually, if you look at that report, there were a number of social cooperatives emerging at the time. And at that time, in the early 90s, there were about 1,200 worker co-ops. Now we're down to under 500. But here we have something where actually they pursued a joining up of the different elements, and not least the coming together of trade unions and the co-op movement, with national trade union agreements in 13 sectors, with union representation for 60% of workers. You know, what's evolved, this is Co-ops Europe data, 24,000 worker and social co-ops, 826,000 jobs, over 401 billion annual euro turnover a year. So a similar turnover to the turnover of co-ops in the UK, but in this particular worker ownership sector, or this very interesting indeed. And of course, they're moving into fair trade promotion, and their work with rehabilitating offenders and jobs for disabled people, and moving into kind of areas that will address climate change. Very impressive indeed. But in terms of building blocks, their ecosystem, the infrastructure, has become, you know, it's very important key to their success. So their cooperative banking structures, their mutual guarantee societies, the way that they offset credit risk and they pool credit risk so that people don't have to put up their own property as security. Incredibly interesting to lower the cost of capital to co-ops. And actually in Europe, there are 23 countries with mutual guarantee societies, or the semi-equivalent public equivalent of the same. And Italy issues about half of all the mutual guarantee keys given, because actually it's such a strong part of their system. And of course, their public policy work for worker buyouts, the social cooperative law of 1991, and also the support from local authorities, especially in the Third Italy, but then, you know, over time evolving to other provinces. So, you know, it can be done. It has been done. You know, the Italian model of solidarity co-ops, you know, that, you know, took out of the playbook, the Italian playbook, a lot of these ideas, and showed the potential to make it work in North America. So, you know, there are real opportunities to get this right this time. You know, we have to get it right. The needs out there are just they're just growing by the day, and we do need to find a way to put the jigsaw pieces together and actually make hope concrete, you know, and despair less convincing. Thanks.
I love that end phrase, Pat. Okay, so we're at 10:02, and I'd like to open it up to a discussion. There's been lots of really interesting and engaged, reflective chatter. And I'm just trying to think of the right etiquette for this, really, because I've got everyone in front of me. So if you could, you've got a reactions button, so you can choose whatever reaction you want to speak, kind of a heart, celebration. But if you choose a reaction, I will choose you to ask a question or to comment and reflect on what you've heard. So Rory?
Because I'm host, I can't actually put a hand up, so in the way others can. I thought that was fascinating, but there are some contradictions that I would like to get a response from the speakers. So Edgar, the emphasis on self-help is great, but then you talked about the need for regulation, independent oversight of the co-ops. So how do you reconcile independent oversight with the self-help mindset? What are you imagining there by way of regulation? And Pat and Edgar, you talk as if social enterprises aren't co-ops, and you'll know from previous conversations, and anybody from the continent would be highly offended at the notion that social enterprises are not participatory, as I think Frisk Breckley would be, who's with us. So you're using the word social enterprise to mean a subset of social enterprises, and I just wondered if you could clarify what your thoughts are around what is, how broadly social enterprises are framed.
And before you respond, there's just one more question coming in, and then maybe you can reflect on both those. So John, you've got your hand up. I don't know where you've got your hand from actually, but you've got your hand up, which is great. I can't see that function. Is it a question?
Okay, so the practical point about a hand is that if you, certainly on my Android device here, this is a Samsung Galaxy Tab A on Android, the bottom right hand corner is a menu called More, and in More you can go into the chat or you can put your hand up. I think there's another option as well. Yeah, disconnect audio, I can love and heart and all sorts of stuff. So that's where the hand comes from.
Great. Well, thanks, John. And if you've got a question, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, I've got a question for both. The first one is a question for Edgar. Perhaps he knows something about COVID that we don't, that it's going to end. And in the absence of globalized capitalism giving up as a consequence of COVID ending, then all the rest of his questions fail. And that's what he's demonstrating to us. Does he think that the end of COVID will be concurrent with the end of globalized capitalism? Got that? Does he think that the end of COVID will be concurrent with the end of globalized capitalism? If he does, that's great. I want to know more. The second question is to Pat, with a request that Richard Bickle, who knows about these things far better than I, and that is that the trade union general secretaries and the CEOs and chief operating officers and CFOs of the big co-ops have retirement pensions, which I think are funded through a stock portfolio based on the stock exchange and possibly government debt. If that's the case, isn't it fantasy land to imagine that the trade union general secretaries and the cooperative CEOs, the Peter Marxes of this world, are going to support a transformation of the economy from capitalism to cooperative socialism?
Thanks, John.
That's the question
Thanks.
to Pat, and I hope that Richard would be able to tell me that I'm wrong on this.
So,
Hey?
so Richard, is it a question? I'm just trying to get questions at the
Yeah.
minute. So,
The question is it fantasy land? Is it fantasy land to imagine that trade union general secretaries, including obviously the general secretary of the TUC and the CEOs of the large co-ops, to embrace a transformation of the economy from capitalism to the cooperative commonwealth if their pensions are at risk, or if they imagine that their pensions are at risk?
Thanks, John. Yeah, I got that. I was talking to Richard then, so I got your question.
Sorry.
And over to Richard.
I've got two questions. I'll come back to John at some point later, but I've got two questions. One is, Edgar made the point about needing self-help enterprises and the skills to run them to be central to the educational curriculum. And in the kind of 26 years I've been involved in the movement, the lack of co-ops on the school curriculum, the university curriculum, adult education and what have you, has been a theme that people have banged on about repeatedly. But I'm just wondering whether, rather than telling other people, be that the state or institutions, that they should be doing it, should we be doing it for ourselves? Should we take a leaf out of our own books and organise our own education? You know, isn't that what we were doing 100 years ago? The other question is, Pat mentioned that over the last 30 years, an increasing proportion of national income has been going to capital compared with labour, and in the last 20 years, wages have been largely flat. When I see data like that, I'm curious as to what part of that is formed by the huge amounts of businesses' cash generation, which are currently being poured into covering big holes in final salary pension schemes, because I know at Central England Co-operative that I'm a director of, between 1/4 and 1/3 of all the cash we generate goes into the closed pension scheme, which closed to further accrual in 2011. And if anything, we're anticipating that that proportion will rise. And that alone prevents us from paying today's staff at the level we might wish to, particularly on shop floor, and also our ability to offer decent pensions to today's generation of colleagues.
Thank you, Richard. Okay, so who am I going to go to first? Edgar, would you like to reflect and respond on those questions? So Edgar, you're on mute.
That's it. Are you?
A phrase of the
Okay.
year.
Okay, I think I got muted. Everybody hear me now? Anybody not? Good. Yes. Well, let's just take John Courtney's points. I think I'm less ambitious than he in terms of the kind of changes we can get. But on the other hand, I'm more ambitious in other respects, I think. So let me try and put it this way. I think if we are going to get real change, there's, if you like, there's this small changes that build up to big things, which we have cooperatives, which can be built from the bottom upwards, but there's lots of other opportunities, again, as pointed out in Pat's contribution, that can be made. And it's in total, when you get all these interventions, they come together and make some big change. But I fully understand that we do need a very significant changes, which will only come when people are mobilized. And you can't rely on politicians, and you can't rely on the chief executives of existing co-ops to change anything, because their priority almost always comes back to preserving their livelihood or their lifestyle. And so we've got to really see that there's got to be an awful lot of pressure, and hopefully the generations that are coming up will be much more inclined to take the kind of action that is necessary. But I don't think we should expect co-ops themselves to bring the changes on their own. But if we have really effective co-ops, the problem is a lot of our co-ops, once they get to a certain point, they mutate because there's no provision in the system. Now, when I talk about getting oversight, I'm not imagining for 1 minute that it's government oversight. It's oversight where you report direct to the members. The trouble is, most of our co-ops don't have a clear purpose. They don't know what their function is. And unless you get people to really understand how organizations work and what systems need to be put in place, you'll get the same thing over and over again. And when you talk about education, and Richard is absolutely right, that it is, unless you can get education in place that actually addresses the fact that you're working with an entirely different set of economic principles, and most fundamentally that in terms of finance has to be the servant of the enterprise and not the master. And that is where the change comes. But the other change comes when you have really effective co-ops. And if we look across anywhere in the world where we see that we get effective co-ops intervening in markets, everybody benefits, not just the members. And I think here we come back to having an education, which I think only the people involved in co-ops can provide. And this was, of course, certainly when I started, I mean, we had the education department, and it was a full-blown education. But the problem was that a lot of the people had arrived at the situation without thinking what it was that they ought to be teaching. I mean, we covered everything at the cooperative college in those days, economics and statistics, the whole lot, but there was nothing said about the actual model of the organization to make sure that it actually stays an effective organization. And what I'm mainly concerned with is looking at how we organize co-ops and how we manage them, and then we can start training people in a proper body of knowledge rather than a lot of myths and misunderstanding which seem to permeate what we're doing at the moment. I don't think I've answered everybody's question, but we can come back to some of those points later if we've got the time.
Yeah, thank you, Edgar, because we're keen, me and Rory are really keen to get you into some breakout rooms to have some discussions as well. So a 5 minute response, and then I'm going to get people into discussion rooms as well, so that everyone's got a voice as well. So, and then feedback. So, Pat.
Yeah, just to come on to, I think in terms of Rory's question, I think you can actually have, obviously, co-ops that have actually become dead, and co-ops in name only, and this is the point that Edgar was making. You can also have social enterprises that are very cooperative. In other words, their existential spirit is cooperative. But what's holding them back, perhaps, is the need for them to give votes and voice to their members and their service users, or make service users members, make volunteers members in the way that multi-stakeholder co-ops show you can do. Some very interesting examples in Wales, for example, we've established a social cooperation forum. We've been doing some work and established one in England as well. It's all volunteers, but so some organizations coming out of that, for example, Cartrefi Cymru is 1,200 staff. They've got 12 offices, services for adults with learning disabilities, and they're a charity, and they've changed their governance, and they've done a workaround to actually enable them to become a cooperative. Now they're called a cooperative, and they're going through the culture change, and they're working with the co-production network, which is the mutual aid networks in Wales, all in this together. And so you have community-based organizations, a good size, former charity, now a co-op, and also in Neathport, Talbot, and Swansea, Rick Wilson has been running a similar organization with a number of housing associations. They've converted their IPS, which was a charity, into a co-op, given votes and voice. They're using Eleanor Ostrom's actually governance, design governance, to actually, improve on, to give the participation element of the members in this multi-stakeholder experiment. And almost nobody knows about what Rick Wilson's been doing for about 5 years. But, it's a significantly size organization. So there's ways and means to do the upgrades or the governance transformation to create an economic democracy for organizations that are social enterprises, and we need to experiment to find the way. But there is good practice out there. In relationship to the issue about Richard and Richard's question and John's question about financial issues and implications of this, I mean, we talked about examples of kind of the enclosure of social rights and human rights and economic rights. That's the business model of digital corporations. And that's advancing fast, and we have to fight against that with practical ways forward. But also, our arms will be tied behind our backs, even if we kind of untie our legs. If we don't actually have somehow access to finance on equal terms, the fact that the bankers were bailed out in 2008 and 2009, the corporations are bailed out again, and there was no quantitative easing for people and planet is, you know, an international scandal, and people feel that. So, you know, Richard Murphy's work about, well, what about, you know, quantitative easing for people, which Corbyn picked up at the beginning of his leadership and then dropped like a hot potato. But I think monetary reform, in a way that post-Keynesian economists would say, well, we should actually kind of, if we're going to create liquidity, that should be for a bailout. That should be, you know, for people and planet. You know, and the work, for example, around the Green New Deal, the work of the job guarantee that Bernie Sanders has been behind. And the people at the Bard Institute are actually working out how that could be done. So there are a lot of economic policies where the existing pension scheme could be, you know, part and parcel of not a contracting, deflating economy that's causing us to squabble over a shrinking pie, but actually there could be commonwealth. There could be a route to commonwealth. And all of the Lucas Aerospace, new Lucas plan stuff could actually be operationalized to tackle fuel poverty, to bring in new technology, to create socially useful production. These are the sorts of, this is the bigger agenda. Last particular point, we have been experimenting with a co-op called Synergia, which runs an online MOOC. Last year we ran it around cooperative transition. We had something like 1,100 people on the course from 40 different countries. You know, we're working to run it again, but we've already run it 3 times with international participation. So, you know, there are ways of rethinking new economics and bringing ecological economics, new economics together with social economics, which we've been talking about here.
Thank you, Pat.
A long 5 minutes, but I was just trying to do justice to these.
No, and it's a long and rich, you know, and it's such rich debate, rich questions, and it's hard for me. So, but what I do want to do is get you into some breakout rooms, because I think there's lots of, I want an opportunity for everyone to have a conversation about this. So the 4 of us are going to stay here, and the rest of you are going to go into 3 breakout rooms. And it's bringing it back to that overarching question, which has all been about the role of self-help mutual enterprises in a post-pandemic world, and everything you've heard. So Rory's going to put you into 3 breakout rooms. Can you appoint a facilitator to reflect back? And then we'll leave the set. So there's going to be 10 minutes in each room. And if one facilitator. Is that enough time, Rory?
Yeah, it's not giving me an option to set the amount of time, but I'll create 3 rooms. So you'll get an invitation to a room. If you accept that invitation, you'll then meet up with the other people who, it's all random, so I'm not controlling who goes in which group. Well, and I'll start planning for 10 minutes from now. Okay.
Rory, where does the invitation go to?
It'll pop up on your screen. You just say yes, and then you'll go into a different Zoom room. Thank you.
Are you going to keep us 4 out, Rory?
Well, you just decline the invitation.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Stay in here. Okay. You got that, Pat?
Yep. Yeah.
Right. You should click now. So, oh dear. It put Edgar, Pat and Sarah into one breakout room, so that's quite a small group there. So I don't think we can change it now, can we?
No, well, I thought we were not going to be involved
it's
in
fine.
it.
It's supposed to be random, but it's interesting that
about
randomness meant
It's
No.
Roger. Roger,
Three of you to one room.
Is Roger not been allocated yet?
So there's 5 in group 1, there's 3 in breakout group 2, and then there is 7 in breakout group 3. Yes, just us 4 left.
Yes, we just left.
That was good.
Um,
It was quite lively compared to some of
yes,
the other
I
sessions.
think we've got these chat questions. I don't know whether it's possible to see them because there's a lot of them.
Yeah, it does. When I save the, oh, hang on, I better pause. Hang on.
For yeah, so we've got 10 minutes, and I've told everyone that I'm keeping you to time to 8:30. So you have allocated facilitators. So can people put their hand up who wants feedback from each room, so I know who to point to? So we've got Freya, Ian, and Mike. So Freya first.
No, Freya and I from the same group, so Freya can take it on if you like.
No, Ian, no. It's up to you. Oh.
Process point, Sarah. How many rooms are we talking about?
There's 3 rooms. So so Freya's put his hand up for the first one. Mike's the second room. I just need one for the third. Freya, do you want to just give 2 minutes? I know it's hard this, but 2 minutes of a general, 2-3 minutes for general.
Well, I was hoping that Ian was going to do this. Well, I think we had a very short meeting and we were confused about the different terms of cooperatives and trying to understand what they all meant: union co-ops, worker co-ops, social co-ops, etc. And I was saying personally that my experience is that that was the same as it in the late 1970s when I was involved in it. And we went off and set up social enterprises just because we couldn't make head nor tail of the co-op movement. And the co-op movement didn't seem to be very supportive of what we were involved in, which was worker co-ops at that time. And I think my experience personally in those days was, well, the co-op movement, you know, we're very supportive of the co-op movement, but we do need to develop something which is kind of more relevant to today. And we added, you know, the environment to our concern and our principles. And that's where social enterprise sort of came out of, really, the worker co-op movements with additions to it. But also I think, you know, the idea of so we were just confused about the different names, and we're partly involved in some of us, maybe people like Ian more so than I am, but for the general public outside, what are they going to make of this? And the other point was that, you know, the co-op are big organizations with big traditional hierarchies and pension schemes and all that kind of stuff. And they just, the danger is that they behave like corporations. And so the internal integrity, the structure of the organization doesn't represent some of the principles, perhaps.
Great, thank you, Freya. Yeah, no, thank you. Actually, it's over to you, Mike. Are you the second group?
Yeah, I'm sharing this with my cooperators, or if that's the right word. I think we agreed we were rather surprised with the lack of any real radical critique and the affirmation of marketized society. That was really our main point. My understanding of cooperative history is that it has a radical experimental tradition from the get-go to create a new form of human sociability and association, civilization even. That's the origin of the word commonwealth. So I was expecting a much more of a debate, actually. I was quite disappointed with the agreement that was instantly arrived at. Edgar's critique, interestingly, is not a critique of market society, but a critique of people who are involved in cooperatives, which is, I think, rather disrespectful. His idea that the left or socialists are pushing a political ideology is of course true, but and we have to argue for that and fight for it against other ideologies and theories. And of course, Edgar's theory is a well-established, respectable liberalism. Samuel Smiles, self-help. So this is a critique. This is a political issue. It's not simply an economic issue about running corporations. It's what we need, I think, in this moment is not either politics or economics, but a critique of political economy. And I think what's the fantastic potential of the cooperative movement is that it really offers us a concrete history that we can build on, so that we don't fetishize co-ops, but the co-ops are seen, as I think they were by the early cooperators, as a way of moving into the future, which at the moment we don't look like we're going to arrive at, but for us, yeah, for us to create. I don't know if my other collaborators want to say anything.
No, thanks, Matt, because I want to get to the other room. But that, there
Right.
again, that could go off on another 2-hour debate. But thank you. That's, I mean, I'd love to respond to that as well, Mike, but I won't. The third group. Do we have a hand up for someone feeding back from the third group? Richard.
We didn't get round to appointing a rapporteur. It was a fairly free-flowing conversation, but what we covered was around how human beings organise themselves to respond to challenges. We talked about flooding in the South Wales valleys. We talked about resistance to the expansion of Heathrow Airport. And we started talking about credit unions and community banks in Quebec. But we were really talking about the collective instinct that people have. So yes, self-help, but collective self-help that simply emerges out of need, which very fundamentally challenges, you know, the core assumptions of conventional economics, which is that individuals are selfish, individual, profit maximizing agents.
Thanks,
But
Richard.
we could have done with another half an hour, really. It was just getting interesting and the time ran out.
I know, and I know, and it's all my fault. So, but I think it's, so it's the personal, political and economics definitely coming out of here. So Pat, I'm going to keep you to 2 minutes, and I really am going to keep you to, and then I want both Pat and Edgar to kind of just have a final reflection. So Pat, as soon as you see me raise my pen, that's so Pat, have you got a final reflection? If you can do that in 2 minutes.
Well, I think Mike Neary, I think the points, the summaries made up, I think I agree that these are the bigger issues. This is the bigger vision. You know, I was just trying to say, well, how can we get started in this one particular area? I think that, for example, the work that the New Economics Coalition in the United States is doing around kind of building alliances around community wealth building organizations and getting them to actually come to a space and having social dialogues like this to develop a coalition for a new economy. That's part of it. I mean, I was very interested in the fact that, I mean, you know, some of the work I think for the National Investment Bank and some of the work that the Labour Manifesto was doing to advance the social dialogue with the trade unions around the green industrial strategy, and also having regional development banks, cooperative development banks, as well as public banks. You know, that's a very important thing, I think, because banks can create money either for private shareholders, or they can create money for, you know, areas that need investment because they're chronically underinvested to tackle the, you know, the crisis of food poverty, fuel poverty, homelessness, all those sorts of things. We do need to find ways of actually kind of getting into banking for real. And then linking that to the existing organizations there.
Thank you, Pat. Thanks. And Edgar, just finally, because I want to give you a response as well.
Yes, and I think I'd like to start by saying, I think there's such a scope for misunderstanding. I'm not here to plug my book, but in the book Enterprises That Change Lives, I have a chapter which is called Meanings Are in People, and then I produced a glossary which tries to explain what these terms are. I wouldn't say this is definitive, but I'd like to think we could take that and get a lot of good minds on it and produce a glossary which at least would be widely accepted, because there's so many misunderstandings. We talk to each other, but we're not talking about the same things in a lot of cases. The question of the market. Now, I spent a lot of time in post-communist countries, and I saw what had happened. And I worked in places like Madagascar, which, they tried to do away with the market, and they just about starved themselves to death. The fact is, there's a difference between the real market, which is a market for real things, and there's a speculation which takes place, and we must separate the two. A real market is where people can buy what they like, spend the money on what they like, as long as they're not criminals. But, in the end, people will respond in a real market. What we've got to see is that it's about resources. Resources, which, if we think in terms of resources, we've got all these people who make their money out of gambling on the movement of stocks, etc. They are taking resources away from people that need it. But you do need a real market if you're going to have democracy. That is my view, but not this market which is based on gambling. And I think we've got to learn to separate between the two. We also need, certainly, our education and our education system that is under control of people who know what we're aiming for. And I think if we can get something around that, getting a rebirth for a new education push in this area. As far as getting, yeah, okay, I'll leave it there.
Because I get a strong sense that this really could go on for another hour, and it would be a joy to. And there is no harm in plugging your book, Edgar. It looks fascinating. I look forward to reading it. And we were saying while you were all in the rooms, we'd love to carry on this discussion at some point. So maybe we'll hopefully at some point. But there's another day tomorrow as well for the conference. So please do kind of. I saw in the chat around environment. There's a session tomorrow. I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone. It's Friday evening, and and it's brilliant that such energy has been in the room, and it's been a joy for me just to listen. So I just want to say a final thank you, particularly to Edgar and Pat, who put a lot of time and effort into doing this. They've put up with me asking them to meet them regularly over the past 3-4 weeks. And they've obliged.
Round off, just to say to everybody here, that is the most vibrant the chat room has been at this conference so far. So, notwithstanding the disagreements that have discussed, but very healthy. We really have had a rich debate tonight. So thank you.
Good. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Brilliant questions. Brilliant comments.